Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. By the way, if you didn't notice, I have a new camera, so let me know. How does it look? Does it look better than the other one? Do you notice any difference? This one is supposed to be 4K, but right now it's not set to 4K, let's say. Mainly because I don't have the SD card needed for that, so for a while it's gonna stay like this until I get the new card. Today I bring you a case that got a lot of attention at the time. Because people thought it could happen to them too, or that it could happen at any moment. What do I mean by this? It's something that happened to a person out of what seemed like absolutely nowhere. Later on, we'll realize that it was actually planned, but even so, when the public in London found out about all this, they thought it could probably happen to them because of the time it happened and the way it occurred. So it got a huge amount of attention. People were very worried. Let's just say they were so worried during that time that they bought tons and tons of security items just because of this story. So let's say it's quite interesting and also quite concerning at the time because things like this didn't exist. Or rather, you just didn't see it that much. A pretty unique case, let's say. So, well, with nothing more to say, up here on the screen, you'll find my playlist of cases in case you want to keep watching this channel and like this content. You can check it out up above in the eye that's on the screen. Down here you have my social media in case you want to follow me on any of them. And with nothing more to say, let's get into the case. The woman you are looking at in this image is Suzy Lamplugh. She was born in London on May 2nd, 1961. She had two sisters and a younger brother, all of them children of Paul and Dina Lamplugh. Her father was a lawyer and her mother had been the co-owner of Slimnastics, a gym-style organization with classes for exercise and healthy eating, along with other life lessons that apparently were taught at this place. She was described as a very responsible person. Suzy had a small group of friends with whom she was very close. According to her family, she was the bond that united them all, a cheerful person who preferred to solve her problems rather than leave them for later. At the time of the event, Suzy was living in Putney, London. It was 1986, she was already 25 years old, and she had decided to become a real estate agent. She had started a year earlier at Storches & Sons Real Estate, a place that was about 10 to 25 minutes away, depending on which route she took by car. Shortly before the events, Suzy and her mother met up since her mother was turning 50 years old. Before the official party, they decided to get together to catch up a bit on each other's lives. In this conversation, Suzy told Diana that she was learning how to windsurf. They talked about how much she liked this new sport and also about how she enjoyed exciting things, in the sense that she was someone who wasn't afraid of trying new activities that were a bit extreme. It should be said, however, that her mother thought the activities she wanted to try were a bit dangerous. And so she had been warned and told to be careful. Beyond her mother's impression, it's worth noting that she didn't mind dangerous activities. She liked exciting things. And it's important to remember this when reviewing the case. With nothing more to say about her life, and since this case is quite long, let's go straight to the facts. First of all, I need to give you a detail before continuing with the story. At that time, real estate agents used written journals in which they would note details about their clients, the houses they were going to, and all the details that were important for their work. Obviously, Suzy was no exception to this. She had her own journal and wrote down the things she was going to do. If, for example, she was going to be absent from work for a while, if she had to go to a house, she wouldn't be in the office and she would write it down in that journal and leave it on her desk. The events begin on a normal day for her. It was just an ordinary work day, it was morning, and no one really expected what was coming because she was in a completely normal mood. She was at work for several hours until 12:30 in the afternoon. During that time, she decided to leave, taking her wallet with her. All she had in her wallet was the equivalent of $20 at that time, which would be about 15 pounds. She also took her credit cards and the keys to the work car. The car she used at that moment was the work car, a white Ford Fiesta, which is a rather important detail. According to what her diary says, Suzy was going to see a client named Mr. Kipper. It's spelled just as you see it on the screen. The appointment was written down for 12:45 p.m. at 37 Shorelands Road. It was written as if they were going to see a property. At 12:45, she was then seen outside a house for sale. There are witnesses who saw her there alone. 15 minutes later, a neighbor looked out the window and saw that Suzy was no longer alone, but was with a man who was wearing a suit and tie, with dark hair slicked back. That is the kind of hairstyle you're seeing right now. Let's say that the people who saw him at that moment described him as a very well-dressed person. According to the witnesses, this man was between 25 and 30 years old. We assume that this man was Mr. Kipper. A few minutes later, both of them were seen walking away together, and Mr. Kipper had a bottle of champagne in his hands. It's important to note that you should remember this small detail, so that later you can deduce who this person is. In the early stages of the case, there were only 2 witnesses, and these 2 witnesses completely agreed on what this person looked like. They agreed on the details of the suit and the face, so they were able to make a sketch later on. Another witness claims to have seen them in Bishop's Park, again with the bottle of champagne. After this, they were seen again at a property for sale on Stevenage Road. Together, everything the same. The bottle, the man in the suit, everything just as before. At that moment, it seemed that Suzy was showing him the houses for sale in the area. However, at one point, everything takes an unexpected turn. Suddenly, another witness sees them together in a dark-colored BMW on Stevenage Road, arguing. They were inside this BMW, and a woman matching Suzy's description was arguing with a man in a suit. The next time someone sees them, it's again in a car, both of them fighting and about to crash into this witness. The witness was driving his car, just driving along, when suddenly this other car, with 2 people arguing inside, comes straight at him, and he manages to swerve out of the way just in time. Inside, he manages to see more or less what was happening, and once again it was a man in a suit arguing with someone, matching Suzy's description. But this time they were in a white Ford Fiesta. That is, at some point they switched cars to Suzy's work car. During the investigation, a shopkeeper talked about selling his most expensive bottle of champagne to a man in a suit. He says that this man didn't even stay to get the change for the bottle. Again, a rather important detail. Let's say that since the incident happened around noon, no. Many people at her work wondered if something had happened to her. It was only hours later that they realized something really must have happened. They then wondered what had happened, why she was taking so long, and whether she had just gone out to eat, or if she was absent for some other reason. The only problem is that Suzy normally wouldn't leave without telling someone if she was going to be gone for a long time. If she was going to be late, or if she had any problem, like for example with her car, she would simply call and let them know what was going on. To get a better idea of what had happened, they read the diary she had on her desk. In this diary, they found out that she was about to meet with someone named Mr. Kipper, someone whom, in fact, no one in the office actually knew. No one had seen him, no one knew his name, they didn't understand who this person was, and he didn't have any contact number either. Realizing that she didn't seem to be coming back, they decided to call her mother to see if maybe they had gone out to eat together. Diana answered the phone and also wondered what was going on because she didn't know anything about her daughter. Not only did she not know where she was, but she also found it quite strange that her daughter hadn't said exactly where she was going. Her co-workers felt the same way. None of them ever thought that Suzy would leave without telling anyone, and her mother didn't think so either. So, she hung up the phone and started telling the rest of the family what had happened. By 6 in the evening, Suzy's parents and her brother were already worried because they didn't know where she was. Finally, 45 minutes later, Suzy's boss decided to call the police to report that she was missing. They began searching for her, and the search gradually became more intensive. Given the testimonies from people who saw her with this person and those who saw her arguing, they started to think that something serious might have happened to her. At night, the police entered her apartment to see if anything had happened there. However, in the apartment, there were no signs of any kind of struggle, nor were there any missing items. So ultimately, something had happened to Suzy outside the house. What they did manage to find was Suzy's Ford Fiesta. It was found at 10 p.m. on a property for sale on Stevenage Road. This had been the second property she showed the man. However, there was no one inside. The car was parked badly, with no keys in the ignition, no handbrake, and on top of that, the seat had been moved, as if someone else had been sitting there. Inside, there was only Suzy's hat and the money she had with her that day. However, the keys were missing. Clearly, this was not a normal situation, so the police immediately launched a search with dogs, helicopters, and every kind of available assistance. At the same time, a sketch was made of the person she was with, this Mr. Kipper, based on the testimony of people who saw her next to him. Soon, the family also tried to help the police search for Suzy. They even ended up using their own dogs. Dogs they had at home who knew Suzy and might be able to identify her. However, it was all for nothing. They could only search for her where she had left the car and near that area. There was clearly the possibility that this man had taken Suzy in his own car, in the BMW, so it was much more likely that she was with him and not near her own car. On the other hand, it began to be considered that this man might have left her in one of the properties for sale that they were viewing. However, she wasn't in any of them, and soon they realized that, in fact, this was all planned. From the way the witnesses described it, it seemed that this man and Suzy knew each other. And on top of everything, it was thought that this person had been planning the kidnapping for quite some time. More than 100 police officers were involved in the investigation, focused for quite some time on finding the suspect's BMW and his real name. But unfortunately, nothing was found regarding this. They spent a long time focused on this, a long time trying to find the person behind it. With the description, they put his photo everywhere after a while when they thought it would really be prudent. And even so, no one found him. The search was actually enormous. Keep in mind that at the time there were no surveillance cameras like we have now, or maybe if there were, let's say, they weren't connected like today's CCTV systems. Right now, in fact, you can go to a website and check out several cameras from around the world. Seriously, you can. There's a website where you simply go in, enter the place in the world where you want to be, select the street, and you can see that place live anywhere in the world. However, at that time, obviously, this didn't exist. So the only way to get any guidance in this case was through the testimonies of people who had seen them. Furthermore, the only thing the parents could do was go on television and radio programs to talk about the case. On the radio, they could say that she had disappeared, as it was seen at the time, and on television, they could simply show the face of the suspect and Suzy's face. But there was a problem with television, and that was that Suzy only had photos with brown hair, and at that time she had blonde hair. She had dyed it recently. So, when people saw Suzy's face, they wondered whether her hair was currently brown or blonde. It was blonde, and this was clarified later. But for a while, that also caused quite a bit of confusion. However, by spreading this story everywhere and putting Suzy's face on the streets and on television, in every media outlet they could, they received tons of calls. Calls with tips, with things that people thought they had seen, which, as we had already seen in other cases, usually make the investigation worse. Let's say it's good if there are people who tell the truth about what they saw, but in most cases, there are many people who simply give false information. Honestly, I have no idea why, but it tends to happen. A lot, actually. It's something you need to know. It happens all the time. And then there are people who say they saw something when in reality they just think they saw something. While it's good to call the police if you see the missing person, you also have to keep in mind that there may be many people calling in with false sightings. Most of these calls then ended up being a waste of time. What was ultimately determined is that Suzy and Mr. Kipper knew each other. Since no one at work knew this Mr. Kipper, it was decided to investigate Suzy's life a bit further. If they already knew each other, then at some point she must have mentioned him. It turns out that Suzy had met someone recently. This man was from Bristol or somewhere like that, according to what the family understood. Additionally, Suzy mentioned that this man would leave meetings suddenly or would suddenly leave early from the gatherings they had, without saying at all why. She also believed that this man had someone important in Bristol, or maybe he had a wife because he was always on the phone, talking on the phone. Let it be clear at this point that the family and everyone around her who knew about this new man believed they were in a relationship. That is to say, they knew each other and were starting to date. And things get strange when Suzy tells her mother that this man had taken her for a ride on his motorcycle and that they ended up at a motorcycle race. And this had scared her. Let's remember that she had said she liked thrills, that she liked extreme sports, and that she was excited by anything that was a new experience. This was clearly something new for her, and yet it had scared her. After looking into the case, after digging a little deeper into all of this, we'll see that in reality, it's most likely that she was more afraid of this man than of the motorcycle. But the motorcycle is also an important detail. Even though she told her mother that she was scared, she also emphasized that she could handle it on her own. All in all, this mattered, that she was going to end the relationship the next time they saw each other. All of this, however, did not guarantee knowing what had really happened to Suzy. And as the weeks went by, the family became increasingly convinced that Suzy was probably not alive. From this, they created a foundation to prioritize people's safety. The foundation, of course, was named after Suzy. They wanted new laws to be established that would make it easier to act against this kind of situation. In the sense that perhaps if someone was being harassed, they could simply go to the police and report it, and that something would actually be done about it. Additionally, the family was also concerned because a new taxi business was emerging that didn't seem entirely trustworthy. Cabs that did not comply with all the required regulations, and they took action against them. And this, specifically regarding taxis, was one of the foundation's most remembered achievements. Suzy's parents, if they were going to lose their daughter, at the very least wanted to ensure a significant change regarding what happened to her. They sought better street safety and security for everyone in the community. Upon hearing about the case, people obviously also wanted more security. That's exactly why I tell you, the people who heard about this case at the time were extremely worried, because it's something that could have happened to anyone. They didn't know where this man had come from, they didn't know what he was up against, or why something like this could simply happen to a person. In the middle of work, something like this. It's unfortunate, but on the path to achieving more security, the family, ultimately, they realized that she was no longer alive and that they would probably never be able to get her back. But they never gave up. A year after the case, unfortunately, no more leads were coming in. Everything that had been searched for was no longer yielding results. Suzy was not in any house. For sale, the BMW had not been found. And on top of everything, Mr. Kipper was still a complete stranger. And this is where another branch of this case opens up. Every single time this woman is searched for online, the name Shirley Banks comes up. Who is the specific woman you are seeing right now? And that's because between the two of them, there was a man as a connection. As it eventually turned out, Shirley had also disappeared, strangely enough, but a year later, on October 8, 1987. That day, Shirley had spent the whole afternoon shopping at a mall. The mall was in Bristol, a city 200 kilometers from London. At 7:40 in the evening is the last time she was recorded using her credit card. She was buying a dress at a store called Topshop, a very well-known store. After shopping, she was supposed to meet her husband to celebrate their 1-month wedding anniversary at a bar, but she never showed up. Shirley disappeared that same day along with her car. The next morning at her workplace, a woman called. She said she was Shirley and that she wasn't feeling well, that her stomach hurt and she wouldn't be coming in. According to her colleagues and coworkers, the voice was Shirley's. There was absolutely no doubt or confusion. They were completely certain it was her. However, by this time, Shirley had already disappeared, and the chances that it was really her were slim. And this is where all the connections begin, so stay tuned because we're about to enter a complicated zone. 3 weeks later, at a clothing store in Leamington, SPA, it was almost robbed by a man wearing a helmet and carrying a knife. There were 2 women working at this place, and both of them managed to scare him off and call for help, so he ran away. By the time the police arrived, the man seemed to have escaped. However, they discovered a discarded bag on the street, with a helmet and a sharp knife inside. This knife had blood on it, which told them that the thief had probably injured himself while escaping. So now they were looking for a person with an injury, probably on his hand. Near the scene, a man was walking calmly until suddenly one of the police officers stopped him. The officer asked him to show both of his hands, and on them he had a fresh, deep cut that was still actively bleeding. His name was John Cannon, and he is the man you are seeing right now. He was carrying some keys with him, the keys to a dark BMW. This BMW was parked right near the store, so they decided to take it as well. And this is where it gets interesting because they managed to access his house with a search warrant. Inside this house, they first found a briefcase that contained a car registration ticket. The ticket listed the car model and its owner. And guess what? It was a match for the vehicle owned by Shirley Banks. In Cannon's BMW, on the other hand, there was a bag of clothes from the Topshop store. a store where Shirley bought a dress on the day she disappeared. But you might be wondering, where is the car? The car was in this man's garage. He had painted it a different color and put a new license plate on it. A new one. It had a license plate with different letters, which are actually quite important. This is the license plate. If you already noticed something strange about the license plate, if you spot any clues about what we're going to say later, you can leave them in the comments. But believe me, it's shocking if you don't realize it. However, there were complications with this case and with the one involving the clothing store. They had to drop the other case in order to investigate Shirley's case. So that's exactly what they did. They let him go for the robbery case and started to investigate Shirley Banks' murder more thoroughly. The problem is that in these situations, they only have 36 hours to definitely prove that he did something. If not, they have to let him go. They had the car of this missing person parked right there at the house, but that wasn't enough. They had to locate her whereabouts or directly find something that proved he had killed her. Soon, dozens of dedicated law enforcement officers were assigned to this case in order to conclusively prove that he was directly responsible for the circumstances of Shirley's disappearance. Again, this is Sean Cannon's face and the sketch of Mr. Kipper. Obviously, that wasn't proof that he had done something to her either. John Cannon, for his part, was no saint, as you can see. To give you a bit of his background, at the first job his father gave him as a car salesman, they nicknamed him Billy the Liar, precisely because he lied too much at work in order to sell cars. He also had a marriage from which he had a son, both of whom he left for another woman, who later left him. For the rest of his life, he committed crimes such as theft, assault, and rape, starting at age 14, when he attacked a woman to abuse her at a public phone booth. Obviously, this man had a huge record of things that would make him a suspect in these crimes. Throughout his life, there were crimes of the same nature happening all around him. After his marriage, there were crimes involving the abuse of women wherever he went. Wherever he went, there were women who had been abused and left in empty houses. For example, it was typical of him to go to houses for sale and look for women who were alone. Inside the houses, he would abuse them. So, it's possible that Suzy was also one of his targets because that was her line of work. This man ended up being sentenced to 7 years for abusing a woman in a clothing store, but he only served 5 and was released. It turns out that months before Suzy's case, he went to London to go through rehabilitation. Just before his disappearance, he had been enrolled in a program that supposedly allowed inmates to roam the city with some supervision. This is mainly to test whether they can really live in society. But look, there's a major flaw in that thinking, and that's that this man later got out and committed crimes. He was in this program for quite a long time until ultimately they decided he was fit to live in society again. They set him free. And he abducted a woman, stole away her car, and he didn't say where she was. But the big connection with Suzy is that 3 days before her disappearance, he was released completely, meaning the program ended. Over time, he made friends, to whom he said during the time he was in the program that he had a new girlfriend, that he was seeing someone in Bristol. After Suzy disappeared, he said that the relationship had ended. In addition to this, to give you a better idea of what he was like, he always told his friends that women fell for him, that they were madly in love with him, that his romantic gestures could make any woman fall for him. And now, while Karen and Mr. Kipper might have had the same personality, while both liked to buy expensive things for their girlfriends, and while both were from Bristol, there was no evidence that they were the same person or that Cannon had killed or made Suzy disappear. Apart from this, there's something else to mention, and that is those who left the rehabilitation program were not immediately questioned. That is to say, they had to wait a while before they could be questioned, which I don't fully understand, but that's supposedly how it was. And I say, I don't fully understand this because, well, it was many years ago. And really, this is all the information I have about how the police operated at that time. Obviously, if you want to add anything else about that era, you can do so to start a discussion below in the comments. However, this is what was done at that time, according to what I understand. They couldn't be interrogated as soon as they left the program. Unfortunately, it couldn't be proven that he had killed Shirley or Susan. So the only thing that could be done was to directly charge him with vehicle theft and assault with intent. This allowed them to have 3 more days to interrogate him in order to try to prove whether he had killed any of these girls. You have to keep in mind, though, that during this time he still wasn't suspected of being Suzy's killer, but there were connections. The first days of the investigation were used to question witnesses about Kanan's behavior and his attitude regarding the days of the disappearance. There was one witness in particular named Christine, with whom he was supposedly going to have dinner. On Saturday, after Shirley's disappearance, Christine had tried to call him all week to cancel the plans they had. However, she wasn't able to reach him that entire week. It wasn't until Saturday morning that he answered after the first ring of the phone. It turns out that he didn't even remember who she was, he didn't remember what plans they had, and on top of that, he seemed very uneasy. He never said why he was so uneasy, but it was clear that he was very nervous. So that was something that really shocked Christine. Regarding the detailed questioning about Karen and the night Shirley disappeared, he started recounting specific stories about being in different clothing stores, explaining that he was out shopping at a different location that night as well, and his account seemed completely real. The investigators suspected that he was using a very common and well-known tactic, which is to recount real events, but from entirely different dates. He was basically talking as if he had been out shopping on Friday and visiting stores when in reality he had done so on other days so that his story would feel real. In other words, he had experienced these things, he had gone to these stores, but it couldn't be proven on which day it had happened. So they couldn't verify his alibis, nor could they prove whether he was lying or not. Because clearly he wasn't lying about having gone to these stores. Incredibly, when they were about to lose the case, they called a woman who had been assaulted or someone had tried to assault her in her car. This woman was in Bristol and a man had approached her trying to threaten her, around the same dates when all these things were happening. The woman managed to escape, and the police called her to testify about the incident and to identify some men to see if any of them were her assailant. Included within the formal lineup of potential suspects was Kanan, so she approached the glass to take a closer look and instantly confirmed that Kanan was indeed there and that he had been her attacker. Thanks to this event, they were able to get 3 more days to interrogate him again, to try to get at least something with which to convict him and finally put him in jail. At least from this point on, they were close to discovering what had happened to Shirley. Even if they couldn't prove what had happened to Suzy, something was better than nothing. Giving him at least a life sentence was the goal. One of the details that proves Shirley was at Kanan's house is that in the morning, after the day she disappeared, a woman called a taxi to the address of Kanan's house. The taxi driver knocked on the door thinking a woman would answer. And when the door opened, it was Kanan. He said there was no woman there and that no one had called for a taxi. Obviously, the taxi driver left without knowing what was going on and very confused. It was only when he found out about all this that he admitted what had happened. And he admitted that this man was probably a suspect in Shirley's abduction. Let's say that if she was alive at that moment, that morning, it probably means yes, it was indeed she who called into work to say she was too sick to come in. Upon searching the house again, they realized there was a laundry ticket. After heading over to the laundromat, they quickly discovered that this ticket belonged to a jacket, which had arrived there covered in thick mud stains. Red, according to the person who had cleaned it. Actually, it wasn't mud, it was blood. At that time, it simply wasn't possible to determine whose blood it was. It was indeed possible to confirm that it was blood and a few other things as well, but that was enough. Enough to prove that this jacket had clearly arrived with blood on it and not mud, and that Kanan was hiding something. But what they were able to achieve, and what ultimately proved that something had happened inside that house, this was established based on a detailed comparison of Shirley's fingerprints, conclusively proving that she had been in the car. There was his fingerprint found on the BMW vehicle. In addition, he discovered yet another of his fingerprints on a piece of paper inside Kanan's house. So at last, it could be verified that she had been in the house and in the BMW. Finally, they had proven that he had killed Shirley Kanan. So finally, 3 months after the arrest, in 1988, Shirley's body was found in a forest, a place Kanan used to go when he was a little boy. The discovery was made by a woman who was unfortunately just going to look for Mo in the forest and came across the remains of a woman's corpse. But well, at last, Kanan could be convicted for Shirley's murder. In short, they had all the conclusive evidence in the case. Shirley's murder, however, was not the only thing he did. As we already mentioned, he committed several more attacks involving abuse and assaults. So finally, in '89, he was sentenced to 3 life sentences, with a minimum of 35 years each. Let's remember, of course, that life sentences differ from year to year. Let's say that in that year, the sentence was probably shorter, much shorter, and besides, it also varies by country. At that time, it was 35 years. Minimum, as you can see there, just as today. In some countries, it's 60 years, maximum. But anyway, this would ensure that he would spend his whole life or most of his life in prison. Obviously, at some point, he could appeal for parole. In fact, in 2023, he will be able to do so in 3 years. But honestly, I doubt it will be granted to him, just as the judge doubted it at the time. The judge himself said that he had to spend his whole life in prison, regardless of what the sentence was at that time. So, on one hand, I say that he's gonna die in prison, but well, we'll see. However, the matter doesn't end here. It still had to be proven that Suzy had been murdered by this man because, obviously, all signs pointed to that being the case. Before we get to the last part, however, I want to show you this video he made for a dating agency. Watch it and judge for yourselves.
I think a ruff would suit me. Right. Tights and a sword. I can see me on some bridge or some galleon, bigger pirate. Yes, yeah. I can handle that. Yes, I have a dislike of inflated egos. People who are, they look at me, I'm great type. I don't like that. Right. I can't handle that sort of inner weakness.
The kind of pretension.
Yeah, I don't like that at all. I just like just normal, average people. I'm in a sedimentary period.
He specifically uses the technical word sedimentary, which directly refers to the process of sediment or sedimentation. The word he meant to use was sedentary, describing that he was in a sedentary phase. This is what Kanan used to do. He would mix up words with longer ones to make it seem like he spoke better, but it clearly didn't work out for him.
Yeah.
Where financially and career-wise I've achieved what I've wanted to achieve.
Yeah.
I'm just now looking for what the next thing to achieve.
On Suzy's side, unfortunately, it was never resolved since the body was never found. However, there were a few things that pointed more and more toward Kanan. In fact, he confessed to it himself, but we'll get to that in a bit. The only thing the family did, aside from the foundation, was to officially declare her dead, but with the presumption of murder. That is, it's not like other missing persons cases. Aside from this, the case remained stagnant until the year 2000, when a new detective was assigned to it. This detective reviewed the notes and came to the same conclusion as before. Most likely, Kanan had been the killer. For quite some time, Kanan absolutely denied everything that had happened. He denied even the slightest connection to Suzy. However, while he was in prison, it was discovered that his fellow inmates called him Mr. Kipper. That's on one hand, but aside from that, do you remember the license plate that was on the car? If you didn't figure out the connection, I'll tell you now. That LP was probably Suzy Lamplugh, and the number 86 was probably the year in which he killed her. The people who were reviewing the case again. Everyone going over the case discovered that it was a very likely connection, and that's why they decided to interrogate him again. From this interrogation, a conversation took place that revealed a great deal about Suzy's case. Let's see. The officer starts by asking him if he remembers Shirley's car license plate. He says yes, and that he also understands what the plate says, and that, moreover, he had sold that car to a wealthy businessman, and that probably this businessman would be facing a significant amount of serious trouble because of what the plate said. The officer calmly responds to him that the one who was in trouble was actually him, not the man who supposedly sold him the car. And Kanan replied yes, that he knew he was in trouble, but that this man had killed Shirley, Suzy, and one other unidentified woman. Obviously, this shocked the police officer because it wasn't just saying that Shirley and Suzy were dead, but also that there was another woman involved. The officer then asked him if the person he was talking about was himself, and Kanan replied yes, that it was him. A few minutes later, however, he retracted what he said, but it will obviously remain in our memories. Honestly, what he said sent shivers down my spine, because we're talking about not just these two women, but a third person as well, and he admitted to it all directly. Besides this, the officer says that afterwards he became emotional, that apparently it was hard for him to say this, that it seemed he hadn't planned to say it. From this evidence, it is reasonable to conclude that he had already killed an unknown person before, and then found Suzy and buried her in the same place. Besides, he probably couldn't leave the third girl there. We don't know why, but, well, for some reason he probably couldn't. And Conan liked to play with the idea that they would never be able to find the body anywhere, so he surely hid it well. I'm assuming that probably both bodies are in London, or rather somewhere near Fulham. Why do I say this? Because probably the first time he didn't have time to hide the body, or maybe he just didn't think about it that much. On the other hand, the second time he said, well, I'll just leave it here and that's it. It must be in a house because he said so. He said it was in a house and it must be somewhere between Fulham and Bristol. Probably. Now, all of this is just assumed. Maybe he did have time, maybe he was incredibly lucky and just left the body somewhere and it simply worked out. Maybe it's very far away and maybe they'll never find it. I'm saying he didn't have time the first time, assuming it was after being in jail, that it was during the time when he was free, but under some surveillance. You see, he had a curfew, but he never respected it. He would go to bars, talk to women, and so on, and so on. So, on one of those days, he probably killed someone, hid the body, and had to return to the hotel where he was staying, without anyone getting too suspicious. That's why I say he probably didn't have time, although maybe he did it before going to jail. And so it could have been anywhere in London, in Fulham, in Bristol, in any small town, in a vacant lot. But let's assume it simply happened after he went to jail. Many years have already passed and nothing is certain. Kanan, he can confess whatever he wants, and if they don't have bodies, nothing can be proven. And what is actually clear is that the person Suzy was with that day was him. There's no other way. It matches the sketch, it matches the behavior, it matches absolutely everything. It was Kanan who was with Suzy that day. Where is Suzy? Who is she buried with? No one knows. Tragically, both of her parents died searching for her and trying to make London a much safer place. Their work will live on forever. But anyway, well, that is it for this case, and that is really all I have. Honestly, it took me quite a long time to finish because I'm just not used to setting up the camera. I spent a lot of time setting it up and I still didn't like it. How the colors turn out, well, that's something for another time, I guess. But seriously, I spent a lot of time and for some reason, it doesn't record. It's been a lot and now I have a ton of work lined up. I mean, I have to record a bunch of videos in a row, so I'm a bit distracted, let's say. I'm not in my usual recording mode, so anyway. Let me know what you think about the case down in the comments. I'll be reading them as always. Start a discussion about where they might be, and if you have more information about it, leave it down in the comments. By the way, this isn't a case that's likely to be solved with technology. It's not like those cases where DNA is analyzed. And we can say if it was him, because there's no DNA at any crime scene, since we don't have the crime scene. If the crime scene were discovered, then the case would be solved, but that probably won't ever happen because we don't know where it was or where it could have been. But anyway, that's where today's video ends. Here on the side are my patrons. If you want to know more about how to support me, the link is in the description. Thanks to everyone watching on YouTube and to those supporting on Patreon. I really appreciate it a lot. I don't have much time to say anything because I have 2 minutes of memory left and 9% battery on the camera, so I'm heading out. But thank you so much for watching the videos. Again, start a discussion down in the comments. I want to see what you think about the case. So here you have a new video, here you have a recommended video, and you can subscribe by clicking on my face. My cat is behind me sleeping. She's been wandering all over the house. Today, I have nothing else to add because I have 1 minute of memory left. Bye. See you in another video. Goodbye.